This is your classroom. This is your world. But how does this and this connect to this? And how does all of this connect to you? Time to find out. I'm your host, Simon Jackson. Decision time. What should we do? How would you balance people and nature? How would you safeguard biodiversity while bridging the urban-rural divide, growing our economy, meaningfully achieving reconciliation, and overcoming divisive cultural wars? Look, picking sides is easy. Knowing who's right and who's wrong, that's also easy. But making the call, living with the consequences, that's hard. We might not live in the society that we want to live in. We might not have the leaders that we want in politics, in business, in advocacy, or media. We might not like the facts we're told or how the facts are presented. And yet today, this is what we have. We can change it, but change takes time. And the question isn't what we'll do tomorrow, but what can we do today? After all, the issues are too urgent and too real to wait until tomorrow. We need to make a decision today, for people and for nature. In 2018, Quebec did make a decision. It chose to write off the only caribou found in the mining-rich region centered around the city of Val-d'Or. Why? Cost, of course. To save the remaining 18 caribou, the government would have had to spend $76 million across 50 years to protect their habitat. Of course, that number doesn't come close to the $200 million that a previous Quebec government paid to build a hockey stadium in a failed effort to attract an NHL team to Quebec City. But it was still a high price tag to save the caribou. Ultimately for Quebec, and for us all, it's a question of resources and how we choose to spend them. And even if you disagree with the Quebec government's decision, remember this.
It's humans that vote and humans that are running this government.
In other words, Sam Sullivan, the former mayor of Vancouver, is saying if you don't like the choices being made by a government, look in the mirror or work to change the hearts and minds of your neighbors.
In order to get this political system to support an initiative, you need to get the people to support it. Because that is the way we make decisions, and that powerfully impacts all of the environment and all of the people.
And that's why this is important to understand. Building a hockey rink, it might provide joy. Saving caribou, it might create pain. As the then Quebec minister noted in a statement about the decision, saving the caribou would also cost 187 direct or indirect jobs, a price the government was simply not willing to pay. That's one decision and one rationale for it. In other scenarios, we've made different choices, in part because the choices were easier to make. Brian Keating, the former head of conservation outreach at the Calgary Zoo, explains.
Right now, at this very moment, right behind you, there's about 30 or 40 pelicans. And those pelicans are an example of the success of what we've got in Alberta. They were on the endangered species list for years. In the early 1900s, they were deemed as being competition to fishermen. And now their populations, because we've educated people, we've gotten people interested because areas are protected where they nest, now they're coming back.
Think about this. The swift fox was extinct in Canada by the 1930s. But through one of the greatest environmental success stories anywhere in the world, they were returned to the prairie landscape, and now 650 can be found seeding plants and fruits and managing important populations of rodents like prairie dogs in what is the most threatened ecosystem type in the world. In other words, the swift fox, like the bison, is no longer a symbol of what's lost, but a reminder of what we can still do. Like bringing back North America's tallest bird, the whooping crane, from a mere 15 individuals on the planet to a population of over 600. Communities and countries work together to protect nesting sites. We physically retaught these birds how to migrate until their impulse is returned. And now, maybe just maybe, you'll find a pair in the Robson Valley en route to a better future. Still, other efforts like reintroducing the black-footed ferret to Grasslands National Park failed. Brian Keating was involved in all of these initiatives, and he says the lesson he learned is this.
You have those dark moments. You wouldn't be human if you didn't have disappointing moments that affected you deeply. But what I've tried to do throughout my career is turn the page and try to get back on track, because I believe that working positively and working with positive people, you can yield positive results.
In other words, we'll have setbacks, but we can do it.
Places like Zimbabwe who have gone way down the tubes, now they're climbing back up again. And I go back there often and I see wildlife populations rebounding. Even though they may have diminished during the bad years, they come back. And it does put back a little piece of what used to be.
Brian adds,
when you have a success, I have found that success breeds success. Obviously, we're going to have to work very hard to make it all happen, but I believe we can do it.
but when we choose to act, it's not always for the right reasons.
So there's kind of, again, politics that take place.
As biologist Dr. Victoria Lakasic points out, if we really want to curb predation of caribou to give them a better chance at survival, we need to stop killing wolves and kill the popular predator that actually is threatening this endangered species.
There's not a lot of evidence that a lot of wolves are even eating the caribou. And then there's other things that is some evidence that they are eating, like bears are eating caribou, but to kill bear is really sort of not popular, so they're not going to go there, kind of a thing.
She's not wrong. Grizzlies are becoming untouchable, especially when it comes to caribou, even if they're becoming untouchable because some of the grizzly bear populations in question are also threatened, as bear biologist Dr. Stephen Herrero reminds us.
Grizzly bears on the fringe, where they have more exposure to people doing different things, that's where they have the highest mortality rate and where they're in the greatest danger of being lost.
Still, the caribou are closer to the edge than grizzlies, and it begs the question, can society be trusted to make the right decision, even if it's the hard decision? Or how about this? Will we prioritize saving an important microorganism if we learn it's more threatened than the caribou or the grizzly? Yemisi Dare is a scientist with the federal government, and she tells us the answer is likely no, because we do tend to value charismatic megafauna like grizzlies and caribou, even if that's understandable. Yemisi says, quote, the challenge of valuing small-sized creatures lies in the greater difficulty in observing their existence, and therefore seeing their connection to anything else. If you don't know it's there, how can you value it? But value it we should, Yemisi explains. Quote, smaller creatures, because of their tiny size, can fill many more kinds of ecological spaces and perform many more functions in ecosystems than larger animals, and they are very well adapted to these varied niches. But most of us don't know and don't care about the fate of a tiny shrimp-like creature known as the crowfium that lives in the mudflats of the Bay of Fundy in New Brunswick. Yemisi says these mud shrimp, quote, serve as a high-nutrient source of food for a range of shorebird species like sandpipers and plovers, as well as a wide range of fish. In particular, birds that are on a migratory path up north to the Arctic use these mudflats for fueling stopovers, where they feast on the crowfium before heading to their wintering grounds. Now imagine if something happened to the mudflats and this species was wiped out. What would happen to all the different bird and fish species that depend on them? It's why Yemisi argues to protect biodiversity, to allocate our resources properly in the fight to save species on the brink, we need to be nature literate. We need to know the roles and values and connections of the creatures we know and of those we don't. Yemisi says, quote, tiny creatures that you might miss if you don't look closely at are hard at work remodeling the landscape by breaking down plant and animal material, recycling nutrients into the soil, burrowing and creating new habitat for other species, pollinating flowering plants, and providing a vital and abundant food source for a wide range of other, larger species. When we're not nature literate, we're prone to making bad decisions. And remember, we're all decision makers, not only as voters, but also as consumers. Think about this. Canada's largest conservation organization, the World Wildlife Fund, acknowledged in Maclean's magazine that the animals they focus on isn't always driven by science, but often fundraising appeal. WWF's Emily Giles told Maclean's, quote, some are selected because of their ecological importance, significance to Canadians, representation of an issue, or even social appeal. That might sound a bit cold, but really what it is, desperation. It's grasping at straws in the hopes of getting Canadians to actually care. And it's within this reality that some are calling for a different approach to species at risk, one that shifts the decision-making process from a popularity contest to a cost-benefit analysis. In New Zealand and in some parts of Australia, it's what's known as priority threat management, but we can call it what it really is: effective cheapness. The idea goes something like this. More than half of our species are on decline, and that decline will only speed up with climate change. We can focus on the animals facing the most dire situations, which is mostly what we do right now, or we can focus on the animals simply of special concern, those threatened but not facing long odds of survival. with species seriously on the brink, we might be able to bring them back, as we did with the whooping crane. Or we might fail, as we did with the black-footed ferret, and appear to be doing so with several caribou subspecies. But if this were Vegas, the betting line would be that this strategy yields far more ferret-caribou losses and way fewer whooping crane wins. And in the process, we're burning our precious resources. As you'll remember, the species only marginally threatened will likely become more endangered if we don't take immediate action. By focusing on the most at-risk creatures right now, we might just lose more than we win today and just set ourselves up for more long odds with more species tomorrow. So as the theory goes, if we're betting the lives of species, the very fabric of biodiversity, why not bet on a winning hand? In medicine and in war, and in Silicon Valley, of course, it's known as triage. But when it comes to the impossible questions facing biodiversity, naturalist Brian Keating says,
Oh boy, that's a hard one. Yeah, it's essentially playing God, isn't it? We used to talk about that at the zoo when we were trying to decide which species we were going to focus in on, and you are writing off some.
It is playing God, and it's a strategy that does write off some life. Is that the right thing to do? Is it the moral thing to do? In many ways, it's just a new take on what's known as the trolley problem, a philosophical ethics question that asks, do you divert a trolley to kill one person and save 5 others who would otherwise be killed?
Ethics is really an investigation as to what would make something right or what would make something wrong.
Carrie Bowman is a medical ethicist with the University of Toronto and consults with governments, organizations, and citizens the world over who are grappling with debates just like this one.
Environmental ethics, conservation ethics is really beginning to emerge as the world and its challenges get more complicated, and what kind of life is worth saving and what kind of life isn't worth saving.
And when it comes to debates like this one, Carrie says,
a lot of the debate is we want ethical questions to evolve and mature along with environmental questions. But what I worry about is if ethics doesn't evolve and the ethical questions don't mature with the science, that desperate measures may be enacted.
Sandra Odendahl is an environmental scientist, engineer, and a financial executive. More than most, Sandra understands the complex web of life and finite resources. She says,
I think the challenge, for example, do you save the mountain caribou because it's going to cost $1 gazillion and the chances are pretty low? Or do you save 6 other species, use that same $1 gazillion, but the chances are higher? You know, that's not just a scientific question. I worry that the other people who should be weighing in and thinking about that and, you know, debating it to come to the right paradigm for how do you make those decisions, I don't know if everyone's equipped to have those conversations because they're disassociated from nature.
Biologist Laura Kennedy understands the point, but as she argues, right now we're defaulting to a position that consciously or subconsciously is conserving species that matter the most to us. And that's usually an economic equation.
A lot of people argue that while humans are a part of these ecosystems, wildlife needs to be managed for wildlife itself and in order to conserve sort of overall biodiversity, not just the species that matter to humans.
In other words, without that approach, species triage won't work. But Laura, she's also a realist.
The problem is when these resources drop, there's often not a plan in place to regain those populations.
The consequence, we're losing too much too fast. And that's why biologist Victoria Lakasik plays devil's advocate. Like many scientists and policy advocates who hate the idea of putting a price on species recovery, Victoria fears endangered species triage is just a license to let go of inconvenient species like the caribou.
It's a really slippery slope because where do you draw the line? And what if maybe this month, this government says, well, we won't let, XYZ herd go. And then 2 years later, another person in the government says, oh, well, we won't let X and Y go, but, Z's not doing any better. So we think we're not going to succeed with that one, right? And then it just, before you know it, they're all gone anyway.
But on the flip side, Victoria reiterates what you've heard before.
The cynical side of me kind of thinks, we can't save them all, and so why bother trying? Why don't we be realistic and focus on which ones we can save or which ones we're willing to save, and just make sure we do that.
In this scenario, what we're willing to save, it's probably also the animals that are the cheapest to save. And to that, biologist Shelley Alexander says,
I understand in a practical sense. Do I agree with that? no, I don't think that the finances should be driving that.
This back and forth is why ethicist Carrie Bowman tells us.
I think the conversations need to be encouraged.
But Carrie also warns we can't talk forever. We need to make a decision, and soon.
There could be cascade effects with biodiversity. We have a very high level of loss, and it's elevating, it's escalating very, very quickly. We don't even know what could be triggered.
Which is why, to make the right decision, Carrie says you need to remember this about biodiversity.
I see it as a massive brick wall, and people are slowly removing a single brick here and a single brick there, and they're saying, there is no effect whatsoever. This wall is as stable as it was before I slid these bricks out. How many bricks can you slide out before you get a cascade effect?
Ken Wu gets the metaphor, understands the challenge.
If we're going to win the biodiversity battle to try to conserve as much as possible, it's too slow and inefficient of an approach, given politics as well, to go species by species, to battle for the listing of every single species, and then to develop recovery plans for every single species and to have those implemented. We're going to lose this battle.
Ken Wu is the founder of the Endangered Ecosystem Alliance, and his solution?
I believe we need an Endangered Ecosystems Act. It will scale up the total rate of conservation if it comes to the fore.
An Endangered Ecosystems Act? Ken says it's
legislation where scientists determine what are the minimum thresholds needed to protect ecosystems so that they maintain their ecological integrity over the long term. And that type of legislation doesn't exist anywhere yet.
By focusing on ecosystems, Ken believes all boats, or in this case species, will rise with the tide. And Ken argues again, it's a more efficient use of resources.
The amount of effort and time and politics involved to go species by species is not necessarily proportionate to the scale of those species versus what it would take to scale up on those ecosystems.
It's efficiency meets science, minus ruthless pragmatism.
Ensure that large carnivores persist over time, you're going to need a lot more land. To ensure viable populations of the whole salmon predator ecosystems, you're going to have whole watersheds and a lot more of them protected in order to ensure all the endemic species that they're finding in the canopies. In the old growth canopies, there's a whole lot of new species of arthropods, insects, spiders, and mites that are highly localized in where they evolved in those canopies over the last 10,000 years. And lichens and smaller organisms, fungi, if you were to factor in things that matter, then it expands how much has got to be protected.
And that's the rub. Cheyenne McKay with the Center for Indigenous Environmental Resources tells us the problem with major national objectives, like an Endangered Species Act that mandates protection of the land, is that it won't always jive with the needs of local communities. And Cheyenne believes conservation must begin at the community level, adding,
we hope that it's the best decision possible given their circumstances. You can't really address the environmental issues in the face of poverty. You have to address both.
Ken, here's the point.
Everyone needs an economy, and it's important. And First Nations who've been deprived of the opportunities since the time of colonization need an alternative as well.
That means for the Endangered Ecosystem Act to work, instead of endangered species triage, Ken believes we need to support communities as they transition to a newer, more sustainable economy.
These are complex situations because many First Nations are also engaged by an active effort in a lot of these industries to log old growth and to engage in oil and gas activities and so forth. And it's up to the province and the federal government and the conservation movement to help foster an alternative.
But many communities don't want an alternative, according to pollster Sachi Curl.
There is a subset of the Canadian population who cannot get their heads around the fact that many Indigenous people in this country and many First Nations are actually pro-pipeline because they see a way to reconciliation and economic opportunity, which is part of that social justice, equality, reconciliation package. When my people can come up to the level that everyone else has been enjoying for a long time, we will feel that sense of equality. The intersections here get pretty complex pretty quickly.
Where does this leave us? In a bind. That's where. Realistically, almost every decision impacts someone's bottom line. Their culture, their beliefs, their livelihood, their sense of justice, our environment. We need to consider this lesson, this reality, when it comes to making decisions on the fate of species at risk, ensuring that what we decide isn't just a solution that works for those who share our worldview, but also accounts for those we disagree with. Otherwise, it's not really a solution at all. That, of course, can seem overwhelming, and is why, for so many of us, we shut off rather than engage.
So Hassan Minhaj, one of the online comedians in the US, has this line where he says, I'm more lazy than I am woke. And I think that's true for many of us.
Dr. Aleem Burwani is the Director of Public Policy at the Cummings School of Medicine at the University of Calgary. And he understands that the issues are hard, that what to do isn't easy or obvious. But Aleem cautions.
And this is true of, personal relationships. It's true of, big system issues. It's true of, a lot of things we do. We don't always realize what we've got until it's gone.
And it's why Aleem believes we all need to overcome our fear and our laziness to help find solutions to this question and all challenges that we face. In the doing, though, we must remember
there's no point in policy, even if it's exactly what people would want, if it's not true, if it's not grounded in reality. Otherwise, it's no different than a wishing well.
That means
the goal should be to facilitate honest, respectful dialogue.
Which is easier said than done. Until you think about this.
Sometimes you just need a turn of that kaleidoscope where you're looking at those same pieces, that same wall in its subcomponents turned a slight way, and now suddenly you can drive that line of inquiry in a very different direction.
So let's do just that. By now you understand why the intersection of people and nature is so accident-prone, so messy for decision makers. And yet that's in part because the decision-making axis has always been environment versus the economy, as Dr. Victoria Lakasik reminds us.
Our economic interests, which are usually the same as our political interests, are things that are often in contrast with what is best for wildlife and our environment. It's not to say that it has to be environment versus jobs. There are other ways, but that's the way we kind of operate as a society in Canada.
But what if we turn that kaleidoscope? What if we looked at this question from a different perspective?
I do think that there's a lot of species that can survive, and maybe it's not the ideal, but they can survive in these modified landscapes that we've created.
Victoria, a scientist and a social scientist, has worked with communities and decision makers to better understand what it will take to save biodiversity. And Victoria says emerging science suggests parks are only necessary because we refuse to coexist with large carnivores.
The large carnivores, we think of them as sort of being in need of pristine wilderness. And I think we're more and more seeing that actually what they need is just people to tolerate them.
Grizzly bear biologist Dr. Gordon Stenhouse has been one of the leading researchers on this very subject. Gordon tells us, quote, our long-term data and published research papers allowed the government and industry to agree with the need for open road density thresholds for these developed habitats in order to ensure high levels of grizzly bear survival. What does that mean? Roads and the activities that usually go along with them, like ATV use, hunting, biking, hiking, are more problematic for grizzlies than habitat loss itself.
That does sometimes require sacrifice on our parts.
As Victoria Lakasik tells us, that means we face a choice.
If the people on the landscape could make the space for wildlife, then we wouldn't need to have a ton of parks.
Famed bear biologist Dr. Stephen Herrero agrees, adding that the biggest threat to grizzlies,
it's really the lack of people being able to coexist. In order to coexist with grizzly bears, you need to be willing to accept a certain set of behavioral standards. Garbage, simple thing, but managing garbage and storing it in a way that won't attract grizzly bears.
It's why Humane Canada's Barbara Cartwright says coexistence matters more than parks.
On one side, we're impacting our environment too much. So can we carve off some space for the rest of the world to live without our influence? But then if we do that, we're going to lose our ability to live together and to maintain the health of the ecosystem with us in it.
Northern Development's Joel McKay agrees that we need to find a way to help nature while still allowing the opportunity for people to earn a living on the landscape. Joel tells us, quote, you always want to pursue a balance between local economic needs and local environmental needs, but reminds us, quote, what needs to be realized is that rural communities, especially those in the north, have few realistic options for private sector employment that are outside of the natural resource industries. Joel adds, quote, the question we need to answer is how do we right-size these industries so that they're sustainable over the long term and operate them in a way that has little to no impact on the environment but still generates a healthy profit margin. Shelley Alexander is one of Canada's leading experts on wildlife coexistence, and she believes
coexistence is possible.
Shelley's work with canids around the globe, and specifically with coyotes in urban Calgary, have underscored this point.
In most environments, if people manage themselves, coyotes or carnivores like that will mind their own business and do their own thing, and the conflict won't arise.
That means
There are options on a daily basis if you're living in an urban environment, to think about maintaining biodiversity, right? Coexisting with carnivores.
That said, even though Shelley knows we're capable of coexistence, she doesn't believe that enough of us are actually willing to coexist with carnivores.
There are people who are calling for just forget this whole save half the world thing, just make it all about coexisting humans and animals. There's limits to that. It's not like we're never going to run into conflict without something going wrong.
Which is why Shelley believes only concepts like nature needs half, Harvey Locke's proposal to protect half the world, will ultimately save biodiversity.
I am still an advocate of maintaining big protected areas where to the best of their ability, these animals can still live out their lives.
But what if in exchange for more parks, having a policy like nature needs half say, we would also need to prioritize cultural and recreational traditions within them, including hunting, ATV use, skiing, hiking, and wildlife photography? Neil Fletcher of the BC Wildlife Federation says the only good solutions are the ones that take into account rural culture and values.
These people are here to stay. They're not going anywhere. They're going to be living on this landscape with you. And the earlier you can get towards working with them and understanding their positions, the better you might be able to find some shared solutions.
And that's why Ken Wu, founder of the Endangered Ecosystem Alliance, believes this is exactly the kind of trade we need to be willing to make.
It's not that you can make an alliance with everybody, but it's just that we can make alliances way beyond where we are now.
Why?
Environmental activists are good at rounding up other environmental activists. As people are, you talk to your own kind normally. You don't normally try to do something uncomfortable all the time and hang out with people who are not like you. That's just not a natural instinct, right? But we're going to lose if we keep on doing this.
Think about it. What if the choice isn't environment or the economy, but culture or the economy? Animal rights or ecosystem rights? How might existing alliances devolve and form? How might voting blocks shift? How might the conversation be altered? There would still be division and disagreement, of course, but maybe not down the same fault lines. And if every debate didn't send our traditional national solitudes to their traditional corners for a pitted culture war, indigenous values versus non-indigenous values, pro-environment versus pro-economy, urban versus rural, east versus west, what might that mean? It could be the spark needed for old adversaries to build new alliances, reshaping our debates and bridging our divides in the process. Right now, our decision-making paradigm is predicated on having our cake and eating it too. But that seems like an old world model. It seems naive to think the good old-fashioned Canadian compromise can still yield enough win-wins for enough of us. By choosing between A, way more resource development than we're currently allowing, way fewer parks, and way fewer recreational opportunities like hunting, skiing, hiking, photography, and ATV use, or B, way fewer regulations allowing for way more hunting, skiing, hiking, photography, and ATV use, but also vastly increasing the amount of protected land and significantly scaling back resource development, we'd all be forced to reassess our priorities and understand what truly matters the most to each of us. We'd be forced to relook at the policy proposals and the economics and the science and the research and the stories of all affected to see what scenario best balances the needs of people and nature. Which isn't to say this is how we should solve our problems, or that decisions are this simplistic. They're not. But we need to re-examine the problems we're facing and how we make decisions. We can't live in a world of zero-sum wins that cost more than dollars or species, but also the very health of our democracy. We need to think critically and act creatively and simply do better in our conversations, our negotiations, and our decisions for people and for nature. In the words of our former Prime Minister, Kim Campbell,
create as much as possible bridges with people who may not think like you to try and find ways of getting around dogmatism and political polarization by finding the common ground they have. And it's hard.
For the sake of our democracy, we must consider those we disagree with when we decide between what we must have and what we only wish we could have. After all, as Shelley Alexander reminds us,
it comes down again to values. What do we want? What's the legacy?